So now I'm going to show you how all this works using an example. And the example that I've chosen is the gun control article that I first used way back in the second class in order to illustrate the critical reading techniques. I've done this not just because this article is familiar and therefore easier, but also because the critical reading techniques and reconstructing arguments go together as part of the same larger process. Critical reading is the first step in reconstructing an argument, and reconstructing an argument is an extension of critical reading. First step of critical reading is pre-reading, meaning look at the context. And like I said earlier, this is a great place to look for clues as to things like what is the main conclusion of the text? What is it arguing for? The context includes things like the title, the author, and where and when it was published. And you can remember that as the four W's. What is it called? Who wrote it? Where was it published? And when was it published? Let's start with the title. It says here, response to licensed users of guns, just like users of cars. I'm not sure if this really counts as a title. I mean, part of it is in quotation marks. The part in quotation marks is definitely a title, but this says response to. It's more telling us what it is than a title. The author's name is Andre Maru, and it says here that he was a 1992 Libertarian Party presidential nominee. And the first time we looked at this text, we talked about the kinds of positions that are typically held by libertarians, including how they feel about guns. Where was it published? Well, there's this helpful little footnote down here. I'll read it out. The January 1st, 1994 issue of USA Today contained an editorial titled Licensed Users of Guns, Just Like Drivers of Cars. It defended the position that, quote, as a matter of public safety and accountability, the states should require that all guns be licensed, unquote. The Andre Maru selection above presents an opposing argument. Well, if the previous editorial argued that the states should require that all guns be licensed, and this presents an opposing argument, what is it then arguing for? Anybody? Yes, it's arguing for, or it's probably arguing for, this information leads us to believe that it is arguing for the position that the government should not require that guns be licensed. So I've written down here, the government should not create legislation requiring that guns be licensed like cars. Also, strictly speaking, it should say the states should not create legislation requiring that guns be licensed like cars. I changed it to the government to make it a little bit more general. If I'd written the states instead of the government, it would have been fine. If I had said the states should not require that guns be licensed instead of the bit about creating legislation, that would have been fine. There's a problem with it. We can always change it later. What I want to point out at this point is that we already have the main conclusion of the argument, or what we think is the main conclusion of the argument, and we haven't even read the article yet. We just got it from the title and the context. It won't always be this easy, but sometimes it will. Okay, so now I want you to read through the argument quickly, looking for any clues to the argument strategy or the organization of the argument generally. So here I mean things like sentences or paragraphs where the author just tells you what the organization of the argument is, or paragraph breaks and things like that. So pause the video and read it, or even better, read the marked up version, the version, with all of the highlighting and notes that we did in the second lecture. So the next thing that we want to do is figure out the argument strategy. Now, sometimes it's better to look for premises and then write those down and try to figure out the argument strategy by looking at the relationship between the premises. But also, sometimes the text will give us clues to the argument strategy or to other things about the organization of the argument. Some texts tell you what the organization of the argument is in the introductory paragraph. Uh, Sometimes there's another paragraph which explains some or all of the organization of the argument. You can also look for things like section headings and paragraph breaks. So this argument is not very long. It's less than a full page in length, and it doesn't have section breaks. And I don't really think that it has an introductory paragraph either. What it does have is paragraph breaks. Well, the cat's here now, so I have that to deal with, but I'm going to attempt to carry on regardless. Hopefully, she doesn't knock my computer off the desk like she seems to be trying to do. Anyway, as I was saying, this text is short. It doesn't have any section headings, doesn't appear to have an introductory paragraph. It does have paragraph breaks, though. So it's quite possible that some of these paragraphs will contain subordinate arguments. Maybe, maybe each one of them contains a subordinate argument. That would be convenient. Maybe there's one subordinate argument in each paragraph, 5 subordinate arguments. That would be very helpful for us in figuring out how to reconstruct this argument. It's also possible that some of the paragraphs contain their own little arguments, and others of the paragraphs may be doing different things. With that in mind, I'm now going to go through the argument, looking for premises and writing them down. So what I've done here is I've gone through the text and written down everything that I think is probably a premise with minimal rephrasing. And because we think that the argument might be organized according to one subordinate argument per paragraph, I have grouped the premises according to paragraph with breaks in between where the different paragraphs were. Let's go back to the original text and I'll show you some of my thinking. It starts off, if anti-gun laws worked, then New York and Washington, the states with the toughest anti-gun laws, would have the lowest crime rates. Now, I think I told you before that sentences with an if-then structure, that you should look out for sentences with an if-then structure because those are frequently premises. And in fact, sometimes they indicate that you're dealing with a deductive argument. If the first sentence is a premise, that means that the author is diving straight into the argument without any sort of introductory paragraph. He then follows up the if-then with a negation of the them. I'm referring to the sentence here where he said, but they have the highest. They is New York and Washington. If anti-gun laws worked, then New York and Washington would have the lowest crime rates, but they have the highest. This is actually, I think, the uh, structure of one of the deductive argument patterns that we looked at. So we're definitely on track here. He then gives some statistics. Crime rates plummeted up to 90% after certain cities and states allowed law-abiding citizens to carry concealed handguns. Then he starts the next paragraph saying, the reason should be obvious. This suggests that the first and second paragraphs are linked according to a relationship of inference. Like the first paragraph, if it contains a subordinate argument, which we think it does, is in support of something in the second paragraph. Or the first paragraph and the second paragraph could actually be a single continuous argument, not two different subordinate arguments. That is a thing that can happen. We can't always count on uh, paragraph breaks to split up subordinate arguments. Now, I did eventually decide that paragraph one and paragraph two were actually two separate subordinate arguments. And in fact, I don't think that there is a relationship of inference between them because they are kind of talking about different things. Let's read paragraph number two. Law-abiding citizens know and obey the law. Criminals don't care what the law is and won't obey it. So who benefits when gun ownership and use are restricted? The criminals, because decent folks are disarmed by the law, making it easier for criminals to prey upon them. Now notice, there's a because here. There's also some repeated terms. Criminal is repeated, and also, although the exact terms aren't repeated, there is a repetition about, oh, wait, the word obey is repeated. The word law is repeated 4 times. So we have these patterns of repetition, which suggest that the sentences in this paragraph hang together in a way that they don't hang together with the sentences in the previous paragraph. I hope that makes sense. The first paragraph is about which states have tough anti-gun laws and which don't, and also which states have more crime and which don't. The second paragraph is about so-called law-abiding citizens versus criminals. They don't seem to be talking about the same thing, so I think we're probably dealing with two separate subordinate arguments here. Does that make sense? Another thing to keep in mind when trying to separate out the subordinate arguments in a complex argument is forms of inference. If there are two different forms of inference being used in two different paragraphs, it's likely that those two different paragraphs contain two different subordinate arguments. I may stop saying subordinate argument every time. I may just start saying argument because I feel like if I keep saying subordinate argument all the time, it's going to get annoying if it hasn't gotten annoying already. I bring up this thing about forms of inference right now because of paragraph number 3. Paragraph number 3 says registering guns and licensing gun owners won't reduce crime any more than registering cars and licensing drivers now reduces traffic accidents. So this paragraph is introduced with a comparison. The first sentence in the paragraph, possibly the topic sentence for the paragraph, if you know what that is making a comparison between licensing guns and licensing cars. No, wait. Registering guns and registering cars and also licensing licensing drivers of cars and licensing owners of guns, right? So there's a comparison being made here between guns and cars. He then goes on to say that registering cars and licensing drivers doesn't reduce traffic accidents and draws an implied conclusion that registering guns and licensing gun owners won't reduce crime. Whenever somebody starts off a paragraph by making a comparison, as he does here by comparing guns and cars, a little bell should go off in your brain, and that bell should say, is this an argument by analogy? Then keep reading, and if the rest of the sentences in the paragraph also make it look like it might be an argument by analogy, then you probably have a subordinate argument. The fourth paragraph starts off saying, like cars, guns are dangerous tools. So are kitchen knives and chainsaws. So the fourth paragraph is making another comparison. Does that mean that the third and the fourth paragraph go together? Maybe both of them are together making an argument by analogy? Maybe it's also possible that we are dealing with two separate arguments by analogy. We'll have to make that decision as we continue. You might notice that I didn't pick any premises out of the fifth paragraph. This is because I think the fifth paragraph is more of a summary paragraph, sort of picking out parts from each of the previous paragraphs and assembling them together in a rather rhetorically constructed package. Also, it's the final paragraph, so that makes sense. The conventions of essay writing say that you shouldn't introduce new information or new arguments in your closing paragraph. Obviously, not everybody obeys those essay writing conventions, but I do think that is the case here. I don't think that the fifth and final paragraph contains any premises. So let's go back to the list of premises that I did find. Now recall that I copied these out of the text with minimal rephrasing. It's possible that not all of these will be premises. We might also have to add implicit premises or subordinate conclusions. And of course, we're probably going to have to do a bit of rephrasing to make the connections between the claims as clear as possible. So let's do that. And as we go, we will look for relationships of inference between the statements, and that will help us to see if there are any subordinate arguments. Taking it from the top, if anti-gun laws worked, then New York and Washington, the states with the toughest anti-gun laws, would have the lowest crime rates. But they have the highest. Conversely, crimes plummeted up to 90% after certain cities and states like Orlando, Florida, and Kennesaw, Georgia, allowed law-abiding citizens to carry concealed handguns. I said before that the first statement has an if-then structure, which frequently indicates premise and sometimes indicates that we're dealing with a deductive argument. So the if part is if anti-gun laws worked, then New York and Washington would have the lowest crime rates. It's followed up by the next sentence, which says, but they have the highest. Okay? So it's like if A, then B, and the following premise says, if it is a premise, says not B. You may recognize this pattern from our list of valid deductive argument patterns. I think it's called modus tollens. if A, then B, not B, therefore, anybody? I don't know why I keep saying this because there's nobody there. Conclusion, not A. So we don't have A, not A here, so we will have to fill it in. Or rather, I should say, let's try filling it in and see if we think that makes sense as a subordinate argument. Okay, so I think I forgot to say that here, since it's if A, then B, not B, therefore not A, it is if anti-gun laws worked, then the states with the toughest anti-gun laws would have the lowest crime rates. The states with the lowest crime rates, sorry, the states with the toughest anti-gun laws don't have the lowest crime rates, so not B, therefore not A, where not A is anti-gun laws don't work, right? If A is anti-gun laws work, then not A is anti-gun laws don't work. Does that make sense? What about the next sentence? It's part of the same paragraph and it is connected with the rest by the word conversely. I mean, this one here, conversely, crime rates plummeted up to 90% after certain cities and states allowed law-abiding citizens to carry concealed handguns. How does this fit in? Well, it's not part of the neat deductive argument pattern that we found, so it's probably not part of the same subordinate argument. Possibly it has it has its own subordinate argument, or it belongs to a different subordinate argument, or possibly it's not a premise. So I'm just going to put in a space here to show how it's separate from the others and move on. Criminals benefit when gun ownership and use are restricted because decent folks are disarmed by the law, making it easier for criminals to prey upon them. Okay, so you will notice that we have an indicator word here. You remember the indicator words that tell us about premises and conclusions. The word because indicates a premise. And in the original sentence from the text, before I broke it up into two different statements, oh, I should probably mention that it's not unusual for when you're reconstructing arguments that you may find that a single statement contains more than one claim, and therefore it might contain more than one premise, or it might contain a premise and a conclusion. All of these things can happen. If you have an argument with one clause followed by a second clause that starts with the word because, that should make you think that probably what you have here is a premise and a conclusion. The clause starting with the word because will be the premise, and the clause before it, the first clause, that will be the conclusion. So what that means is we need to reverse the order here because we want premises flowing into conclusions. The the uh, the flow, the downward flow is the direction of inference, and we want to be consistent. Okay, so since we're saying this is a premise, for now, we don't need the word because. Also, it's not a proper sentence starting with the word because. For reasons. Decent folks are disarmed by the law, make it easy for criminals to prey upon them. Therefore, criminals benefit when gun ownership and use are restricted. Does the second one, criminals benefit, seem to follow from the first one? decent folks are disarmed by the law? I think so. So I am going to change this letter P here to SC for subordinate conclusion. Now we're going to have to do a little bit of rephrasing here to make it flow better, to make the connection between the premise and the conclusion as evident as possible. The premise doesn't actually say anything about gun ownership being restricted, so we'll need to add something, possibly rephrasing the premise, possibly adding an implicit premise. I'm going to take a term from the previous statement. Restricting gun ownership takes guns out of the hands of law-abiding citizens. Restricting gun ownership takes guns out of the hands of law-abiding citizens. This makes it easier for criminals to prey upon them. See what we have now. 1. Restricting gun ownership takes guns out of the hands of law-abiding citizens. Add that to 2. This makes it easier for criminals to prey upon them. Therefore, 3. Criminals benefit when gun ownership and use are restricted. Aha! That sounds like an argument to me. Okay, so I said that the next one, meaning the next paragraph, starts off by comparing guns to cars and made me think, and this made me think that it might be an argument by analogy. This is helpful because an argument by analogy has a fairly specific and straightforward structure, and structure is exactly what we're looking for. So let's see if we can fit these statements into the form of an argument by analogy while remaining faithful to what we think the author's intent was. Because we can't just rephrase it into whatever we want. Our goal is to understand it, not to change it. We want to understand it the way it is, not change it into something else. So the structure of an argument by analogy is first premise. Two things are compared. One thing is like another. And then in the second premise, something is said to be true of one of the things, and the conclusion, in this case, the subordinate conclusion, the inference that's made is that what is true of the first thing is also true of the second thing. Is that what's going on here? Okay, so we have a comparison between registering gun owners and, registering guns and licensing gun owners is being compared quite directly to registering cars and licensing drivers. Go back and look at the original text, which incidentally is a good thing to do often. Registering guns and licensing gun owners won't reduce crime any more than registering cars and licensing drivers now reduces traffic accidents, which is to say hardly at all. Oh, okay, yes. So that's important. I should not have cut that out. Or I should have included that in my list of possible premises. Registering guns and licensing gun owners won't reduce crime any more than registering cars and licensing drivers reduces traffic accidents, which is to say, hardly at all. What does he mean when he says, which is to say, hardly at all? Hardly at all is a way of saying that registering cars and licensing drivers doesn't reduce traffic accidents. That is a wild and wacky thing to say, but it is absolutely implied by the logic of his argument. So we need to include it in our reconstruction. Registering cars and licensing drivers doesn't reduce traffic accidents. It's probably worth mentioning right now that part of the or one of the benefits of reconstructing arguments in this way, separating out the different premises and adding implied premises, is because when it comes to evaluating it, which we're not doing yet, but we will get to that later in this lecture. When it comes to evaluating it, you can see all of the parts of it laid out in front of you and how they fit together. And it can happen that the 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 problem, if there is a problem, it can happen that there is a problem with one of the premises that's not stated but is merely implied. In fact, maybe that's why the author chose to imply the premise rather than state it flat out, because he's thinking that if he stated it flat out, the fact that the premise is obviously untrue, well, the reader would pick up on that. But by making it an implied premise, by sort of hiding it in the rhetorical structure of one of his other sentences, he thinks that, if you're not reading closely, you might not catch it. But we are reading closely. Okay, so what about the comparison part? I said that in an argument, by analogy, two things are compared. One thing is said to be like another thing. So what are the two things that are compared? Oh, I've already said registering guns and licensing gun owners is compared to registering cars and licensing drivers. So let's make that explicit. Registering guns and licensing gun owners is like registering cars and licensing drivers. Registering cars and licensing drivers doesn't reduce traffic accidents. So two things are being compared, guns and cars. Something is said to be true of one of the things. Registering cars and licensing drivers doesn't reduce traffic accidents. Therefore, that is also true of the other thing. Okay, so I wrote registering guns and licensing gun owners won't reduce gun deaths. Do you see how that is equivalent to reducing traffic accidents? This might be a good time to remind you that reconstructing arguments is more of an art than a science when it comes to rephrasing premises and figuring out, what is this referring to? Is it referring to this, or is it referring to this? You're frequently going to have to make choices, and there's not necessarily one correct answer. Maybe different interpretations are equally valid. So don't fret over getting it exactly right. Instead, ask yourself, does this make sense? Does this seem like something that someone would actually say? And also, does it seem like what the person is actually saying? And also, hopefully, is it more clear than the way they said it? Keep in mind that this analogy is in service of the main conclusion of the text, which we have already decided is that the government should not require licenses for guns. So if all of this is trying to convince us there shouldn't be legislation requiring that guns be licensed like cars, that totally connects to this cars are like guns or guns are like cars bit, right? And saying that registering guns and licensing gun owners won't reduce gun deaths does appear to support his main conclusion that the government shouldn't require licenses for guns. what do we do with these remaining statements here? Millions of highly restrictive laws, 44,000 Americans die yearly in traffic accidents. I think it's probably here to support the claim registering cars and licensing drivers doesn't reduce traffic accidents. What about the rest? 15,000 are shot to death, fewer cars than guns. Cars are clearly more dangerous than guns. This makes it sound like he's trying to make an argument that cars are more dangerous than guns, but cars are more dangerous than guns doesn't really support the conclusion that guns, uh, that the government shouldn't require licenses for guns. And remember, not everything in the text is always going to be part of the argument. So I'm going to make things a little bit easier for us and just remove that. That leaves us with guns are like kitchen knives and chainsaws. We don't register or restrict kitchen knives and chainsaws. Now, that's a little bit of rephrasing from paragraph number 4. Guns are dangerous tools, so are kitchen knives and chainsaws. Should we register or outlaw them just because something is dangerous? Okay, this is not helpful. The important part is that he's definitely saying guns are like kitchen knives and chainsaws. And when he has a sentence, do we restrict their use or require licenses for them? Well, that's what they call a rhetorical question. It's a statement disguised as a question. He certainly doesn't think that we should require licenses for kitchen knives and chainsaws. So we can just write that down. In plain language, we don't register or restrict kitchen knives and chainsaws. And if this is also an argument from analogy, well, I think the logic is since we don't register or restrict kitchen knives and chainsaws, and guns are like those things, then we also should not register or restrict guns. So I'll write that down. Okay, so that's very encouraging. We were able to find how many? We were able to find 1, 2, 3, 4 subordinate arguments. And they did, more or less, not exactly line up with the paragraphs. Or what I should say is the paragraph, it wasn't like there was one argument per paragraph. It was more like the paragraph breaks were a guide to when one subordinate argument finished and another one began. Okay, so I have now I have now numbered the premises and subordinate conclusions. And also, while I was doing that, I smoothed out the phrasing of some of them to make the connections a bit more evident. So you want to, so, so for instance, down here, premise 4 and 5. Restricting gun ownership takes guns out of the hands of law-abiding citizens. And then we said, this makes it easier for criminals to prey upon them. Well, when you're reconstructing arguments, it's best to make things as explicit as possible. So I replaced the this with what the this was referring to. And I did that did that sort of thing in 1 or 2 other places too. Why did I add the numbers? Well, you see, the purpose of the numbers is to make it easier to refer to them. So for instance, we decided that this one here, P10, it's a bit awkward having to say this one all the time. So it's helpful to be able to call it P10, but that's not even my point. we decided that P10, which says with millions of highly restrictive laws, still about 44,000 Americans die in car accidents. We decided that that was in support of P8. So, like, how are we going to represent that relationship? Well, we could we could draw an arrow from the P10 to the P8 like this, except I don't think that's something that you can do in this app. So for the moment, I'm just going to write supports P8. And isn't it nice that we can refer to the the premises by numbers instead of having to write out the whole thing? Having the numbers is especially useful if we decide that we need to construct an argument diagram. But before we get to this stage, we need to read over what we have here and make sure that it, one, makes sense, and two, faithfully reflects, we think, what the author was trying to say in the text. And when I say makes sense, that I mean that in terms of, do the premises provide support for these subordinate conclusions? Do the subordinate conclusions provide support for the main conclusion? Because that's what the whole thing is about, right? It's all in service of the main conclusion. It's all supposed to be flowing there. If something that we came up with here as a subordinate conclusion doesn't support the main conclusion, well, maybe we misunderstood the author's intent, or maybe that if it doesn't lead us to the main conclusion, maybe it wasn't part of the argument. Not every statement has to be part of the argument. After all, sometimes in longer texts, there are even like little arguments that don't go anywhere, like tangents. And of course, counter arguments are a thing. So let's have a look and see what we find. So just to remind you, what we're doing now is we're going to look at the subordinate conclusions and see if they support the main conclusion. The first subordinate conclusion is SC3 here. Anti-gun laws don't work. Does that support the main conclusion down here? Oh, by the way, I altered the document a little bit to put the main conclusion at the bottom because the direction of inference is supposed to flow down. So anyway, anti-gun laws don't work. Does that support the main conclusion? Anti-gun laws don't work. Therefore, the government should not create legislation requiring that guns be licensed like cars. Okay, I think this supports the main conclusion. If we read legislation requiring that guns be licensed like cars as meaning the same thing as anti-gun laws, then I think the conclusion does follow because it's saying that these laws don't work. So why would we institute them? Now, does anti-gun laws mean the same thing as legislation requiring that guns be licensed like cars? Well, normally I would say no. Anti-gun laws, that seems like a term for a broader category of laws that might include laws like that, but also laws saying that you can't carry guns at all, like most countries have. However, in the context of this text, we know that it is written in an attempt to refute the position that the government should create laws requiring that guns be licensed like cars. So from the context, I think we have to infer that when he says anti-gun laws, he's referring to these laws specifically. So far, first subordinate conclusion, yes, does support the main conclusion. So good. Next one. Criminals benefit when gun ownership and use are restricted. Therefore, the government should not create legislation requiring that guns be licensed like cars. Well, again, requiring that guns be licensed like cars is restricting gun ownership and use. So, yeah, they seem to be talking about the same thing. The conclusion, the subordinate conclusion does seem to support the main conclusion. Registering guns and licensing gun owners won't reduce gun deaths. Therefore, the government should not create legislation requiring that guns be licensed like cars. Okay, well, in this case, the subordinate conclusion is specifying that it's talking about the same kind of laws, and it says it won't reduce gun deaths, therefore, we shouldn't create this legislation. Makes sense to me. But the final subordinate conclusion, we should not register or restrict guns. Therefore, the government should not create legislation requiring that guns be licensed like cars. Okay, so SC13 could be interpreted as saying the same thing as the main conclusion. Shouldn't register or restrict guns, shouldn't create legislation that requires the registration of guns. It sounds like it's kind of the same conclusion in other words. We have a much more pressing question before us, which is the question of, do we need to draw an argument diagram for our reconstruction of this text? Well, as I said before, when I was talking about argument diagrams, they're really only necessary when putting the argument in standard form doesn't sufficiently or sufficiently clearly express the relationships of inference between the different parts of the argument. And I don't think that's the case here. There's only one instance here where the relationships of inference between the premises is not represented by the standard argument form structure, and that's P10 here. And here I just put in brackets here that it supports P8. I did that because I couldn't draw an arrow from it to P8. So I really don't think it's necessary to draw an argument diagram for this one. It is adequately clear without it. However, because I'm demonstrating this as an example, I thought I ought to do an argument diagram anyway, so here it is. And in looking at this argument diagram, I think you will immediately understand why it wasn't necessary to draw an argument diagram, because all I did was I took the P1, P2, S3, which is I don't know, I'm gesturing with my hand. It's already up here, and put it together with the arrow from the SC3 to the MC, which 2 minutes ago I said was not necessary, and the same thing with all of the rest. In fact, it looks very much like one of the argument diagrams for the multiple independent argument strategy. Maybe I'll insert a picture of it here in the edit. And of course, those examples were the simplest and most straightforward version of the argument strategy. Now, it may not have been necessary for us to have drawn an argument diagram for this, but I think equally, it's not necessary for me to explain it because it's so straightforward. The only way that it deviates from the example, from one of the examples for the multiple independent subordinate arguments is the addition of P10 here. P10 with an arrow to P8. Is that giving you deja vu? Because it was just a couple of minutes ago that I said the only thing that was not represented by the standard argument form here was that P10 supports P8, and I said, I wish I could draw an argument from P10 to P8. Sorry, I wish I could draw an arrow from P10 to P8, and I just did that. So there, it's done. Hooray. So the argument strategy here is multiple independent arguments, and that's represented in the diagram. The reason why it's multiple independent arguments and not a single main argument with subordinate conclusions, I mean, it does have subordinate conclusions, but they're independent arguments because each one of these subordinate arguments, if I could draw a circle around each one of them supports the main conclusion independently. So, for example, first one, uh, anti-gun laws don't work. Well, that supports the main conclusion regardless of whether the other subordinate conclusions are here or not. So anti-gun laws don't work. That provides support for that supports the main conclusion. And the next subordinate conclusion is criminals benefit when gun ownership and use are restricted. Well, that is a separate point. Likewise, if this subordinate argument here, P4, P5, and SC6, if this was all by itself and the others were not here, that would still work as an argument for the main conclusion. It wouldn't be as strong because it wouldn't be conveying as much support, but it would still be the case that criminals benefit when gun ownership and use are restricted is a reason to not restrict gun ownership. And the same thing applies for the other two. I won't go through them. The idea here is that it's multiple independent arguments when they are independent and don't require each other. It's a single main argument with subordinate arguments the when the conclusions that directly support the main conclusion require one another in order to support the main conclusion. If it was a deductive argument, for example. So if SC 3, 6, 9, and 13 were part of a deductive argument, well, then they would have to work together. They wouldn't support the main conclusion independently, and we would represent that differently. It would look more like this image that I'm going to magically insert now with the power of editing. Abracadabra. So you see how P1 and P2 are stacked on top of each other above SC3, and likewise for P4, P5, and SC6. Well, that represents something. That represents that they work together in a way that SC3 and SC9 don't work together. And that's why in the sample diagram for single main argument, like they are stacked on top of each other to represent the fact that they do work together and not independently. I hope that makes sense. Will you have to draw an argument diagram for your argument reconstruction assignment, which is due next week? Well, you will have to if you think that it is necessary in order to clearly represent how the different parts of the argument fit together. Or to put that another way, you will have to, if the argument is sufficiently complex that's necessary, if there are more complicated relations than you see here. But if it's not necessary, if you can represent the structure of the argument just by the standard form representation, like I said we were able to do with this one, then no, you don't have to draw an argument diagram. If you are worried, if you are concerned, whether you'll lose marks if you don't, well, then I would recommend drawing an argument diagram, but it's not required in all cases.